Hello, brother. How was your day today? If possible, please let me know where you are on Earth. As for me, my day was quite boring. Let me share it with you. Today at school, I had a bit of a debate with my classmates on the following topics: history and political mysteries. The question here is Napoleon's secret deal, the map that reversed history, and I will share my personal views. Let's analyze it together. Imagine you are in a climate-controlled vault, deep beneath the stone arches of the French National Archives. The air is cold, sterile, and smells of ancient paper and binding glue. In your gloved hands, you hold a higher-resolution facsimile of the original Louisiana Purchase Treaty from 1803. The document that, for a mere $15 million, doubled the size of the nascent United States and effectively ended France's colonial ambitions in the Americas. It feels heavy, not just from the quality of the vellum, but from the sheer weight of history it represents. But as your eyes scan the flowing, elegant script, you see something that doesn't belong. A flicker in the periphery. A ghost in the machine of history. After this video, you'll never look at the world the same way. Before the tension gets too high. Take a moment to like the episode and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your location and the time on your clock right now in the comments below. Now dim the lights, prepare yourself, and let's unravel this hidden truth together. You lean closer, adjusting the cold white light of the archivist's lamp. The official narrative is clean, almost insultingly simple. Napoleon Bonaparte, first consul of France, bogged down by the Haitian Revolution and staring down the barrel of another war with Britain, needed cash. The vast untamed territory of Louisiana was a strategic liability, impossible to defend from the Royal Navy. So, he sold it. For a pittance, roughly 4 cents an acre. It's presented in history books as a pragmatic, if short-sighted, decision, a masterstroke of diplomacy for Thomas Jefferson, and a simple financial transaction for Napoleon. But this explanation feels thin, flimsy, like a poorly constructed stage prop. You are looking at the work of a man whose ambition was legendary, whose strategic genius was so profound it redrew the map of Europe. This is the man who crowned himself emperor, who saw himself as a successor to Caesar and Charlemagne. Does a man like that sell an empire for pocket change? The psychology of it feels wrong. It's an action so out of character that it screams for a deeper explanation. You begin to analyze the context not as a historian, but as a profiler. Napoleon didn't make mistakes of this magnitude. He made calculated sacrifices. Every move, even an apparent retreat, was part of a larger, unseen offensive. He didn't cede territory, he repositioned assets, and that's when you find it. Not in the main body of the text, but on a separate, appended notice schedule of payments. It's a mundane detail, the sort of annex that most researchers would gloss over. But your attention is snagged by a watermark, pressed into the very fibers of the paper. It's not the usual fleur-de-lis or maker's mark. It is a small, intricate symbol, a serpent coiled into a perfect circle, consuming its own tail. The Ouroboros, an ancient symbol of eternity and cycles. But this one is different. There is a tiny, almost imperceptible break in the circle, a small gap just behind the serpent's head, as if it has paused its eternal consumption. This detail is bizarre, a piece of symbology completely out of place in a dry financial document. It's not a printer's error. The lines are too deliberate, too precise. It feels like a signature. A quiet declaration from an organization that operates in the margins, one with no public records. You start to connect this to the verifiable facts. The Louisiana Purchase was finalized on April 30th, 1803, for the price of 80 million francs. The United States acquired over 828,000 square miles of territory. This is the solid ground of history. But as you stare at the broken Ouroboros, the ground begins to feel less stable. You consider the human element. The French negotiator, Francois Barbe Marbois, was a man restored to power by Napoleon after a period of exile. His loyalty was absolute, yet accounts of the negotiations describe him as unusually anxious, his hands trembling as he presented the final offer. Was he merely nervous about the monumental deal, or was he aware that he was facilitating 2 transactions at once? One, a public sale of land for money. The other, a private trade of something far more valuable. This symbol, this small imperfection, is a loose thread. When you pull it, the entire tapestry of the official story begins to unravel. It suggests that the Louisiana Purchase was not an end, but a beginning. It was a down payment. The public saw a transfer of land, but you are beginning to suspect that behind the curtain of geopolitics, a different kind of commodity was being bartered. Napoleon wasn't selling a piece of North America. He was buying something else entirely, something that couldn't be measured in francs or acres. The document in front of you is a receipt, but the line item for the most important part of the purchase is invisible. The transaction wasn't just about shaping the future of a continent. It was about securing control over the past. But the real question remained. If the sale of an empire was just the first installment, what could possibly be worth so much more? The broken Ouroboros on the payment schedule was a crack in the facade of history, and now you are driven to find another. Your search takes you forward in time, away from the dry legalities of 1803 to the raw. Theatrical display of power, on December 2, 1804, you are no longer in a quiet archive, but standing as a silent observer inside the vast, cold expanse of Notre Dame Cathedral. The air is thick with the scent of incense and melting beeswax from thousands of candles. Light filters weakly through the stained glass windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny spirits. This is the day Napoleon ceases to be just a man, a first consul. Today he becomes an idea, an emperor, sanctified by his own ambition. He lifts the crown, not waiting for the Pope to bestow it, and places it on his own head. It is an act of breathtaking arrogance, a message to the world that his power comes from himself alone, or does it? As you watch the ceremony unfold in your mind's eye, you focus on the physical details, the artifacts of this transformation. Your attention settles on his coronation robes, a mantle of deep crimson velvet weighing more than 80 pounds, so heavy it required for attendants to carry. This is a verifiable historical fact, the mantle now preserved. It was famously adorned with scattered golden bees, embroidered with gold thread. Napoleon chose the bee as his personal emblem, symbol of the ancient Merovingian kings. To connect his new dynasty with the very roots of France and reject the fleurs de lis of the recently overthrown Bourbons. It was a masterful piece of political branding, projecting an image of immortal, resurrected power. The public saw a link to ancient French glory. But you are beginning to see something else. You are now examining ultra-high-resolution photographs of this very mantle. The velvet is worn, the gold thread slightly tarnished by 2 centuries of time, but the details are perfectly clear. There are hundreds of bees, each one a tiny masterpiece of needlework. They appear identical at first glance, a swarm of imperial symbols. But then your training in pattern recognition kicks in. You start to notice inconsistencies. On one bee, the angle of the left wing is a few degrees sharper. On another, near the ermine collar, the abdomen has 5 stripes instead of the usual 6. A third, hovering near an embroidered laurel wreath, has its antennae curved inward, not outward. These are not mistakes. Craftsmanship is too perfect for such random errors. This isn't just decoration. It is data, hidden in plain sight. You realize you are looking at a cipher, one of the most brilliant and bizarre you have ever encountered. This is the hallmark of the organization. You are hunting a flair for the theatrical. A preference for methods that are as much about psychological dominance as they are about secrecy. Anyone can write a code on a piece of paper and hide it. It takes a unique kind of audacity to wear your code on your back during your coronation. Broadcast to the entire world, utterly confident that no one but the intended recipient will ever understand it. It is a message of partnership. Napoleon isn't just a client of this group. He is a collaborator, flaunting their shared secret before the eyes of God and all of Europe. You begin the painstaking process of analysis. It's not a simple substitution cipher. The variations in the bee's wing angle, stripe count, antennae curvature, the variables. But what is the key? You hypothesize that the key is positional. The meaning of each non-standard bee is determined by its location relative to the other larger embroidered symbols on the mantle, the eagles, the laurel wreaths, the letter N. It's a 3-dimensional grid projected onto a 2-dimensional surface. To an outsider, it's just a beautiful garment. To someone with the key, it's a complex instruction manual. This is the quirky, almost insane level of detail these people operate on. Their secrets are protected not by locks, but by obscurity and context. The implications are staggering. The Louisiana Purchase was the agreement in principle, sealed with the broken Ouroboros. The coronation mantle, you suspect, contains the specific terms of the deal. The payment was an entire continent. The contract was written in gold thread on the emperor's back. As you map the sequence of the altered bees, a pattern begins to emerge. It's not text. It's not numbers. In a conventional sense, it appears to be a series of astronomical alignments tied to specific dates. Not dates in the future, but dates in the past. Long, long before Napoleon was born. The code isn't a message. It's a set of coordinates, but the coordinates are for a point in time. The cipher points to a forgotten fulcrum in history, a moment when something went wrong, but the real question remained. If you could decipher this code hidden on the emperor's back, what forgotten moment in history would it reveal? The sequence of anomalous bees on the coronation mantle gives you a series of temporal coordinates, but they are useless without a key. They are like addresses without a city, phone numbers without an area code. Frustration mounts. You are holding one half of a key, a message that is inert because you are not its intended recipient. This forces a shift in your analysis. You have been focused on the cipher, the symbol, the document. But the more critical question, the one that unlocks everything else, is the who. Who was this message for, and who sent it? The broken Ouroboros, the ciphered mantle. These are not the work of a single individual, but the signature of a collective. A group with a consistent and deeply strange methodology. You realize you are not just chasing Napoleon's secret. You are on the trail of the people with whom he made his deal. You are now looking for ghosts in the annals of history and organization defined by its absence from the record. There's no charter, no manifesto, no official name. To call them a secret society is to misunderstand their nature. Their protection is not secrecy, but obscurity. They are a historical organization with such limited public records that they effectively do not exist. In the corridors of power, they are whispered about not as a cabal, but as a shadow cabinet. A council of advisors who offer perspectives that transcend politics, economics, and even national borders. Their counsel is sought by emperors and kings, not for advice on how to win a war, but on how to prevent one so catastrophic it would unravel civilization. They are not players in the game of history. They are its self-appointed referees. You begin to build a profile of this entity. Their primary concern is not power or wealth, but balance. They see history as a complex, dynamic system, a grand equation that is constantly on the verge of collapsing into chaos. Their purpose is to identify points of critical instability, moments where a single event could trigger a domino effect, leading to a dark age or an existential threat, and to make minute, precise interventions to restore equilibrium. This is their core psychology. They are cosmic surgeons, and their patient is the timeline itself. This explains their methodology. Their actions must be invisible, their influence untraceable, leaving behind only strange anomalies that historians might puzzle over for centuries, but never fully comprehend. Membership, you theorize, is not hereditary or political. It is cognitive. They recruit from the margins, seeking out minds that see the world in terms of patterns, systems, and long-wave cycles. They are the mathematicians who see equations in the migration of birds, the astronomers who find political cycles in planetary orbits, the archivists who sense the echoes of the future in the records of the past. Here you find a verifiable anchor. The French Archives Nationales was formally established in 1790, just over a decade before the Louisiana Purchase. You can picture this organization seeing the creation of such a centralized repository of information. It's not as a mere bureaucratic convenience, but as the creation of a vital new organ for the state of national memory. And like any other organ, it could be monitored, influenced, and even co-opted. They would have embedded their people there from the very beginning, using the archives as both a listening post and a recruitment tool. This leads you to the bizarre, quirky nature of their operations. They don't send recruitment letters. Their calling card is an unsolvable problem. A potential candidate, a brilliant but overlooked academic. A government cartographer with an obsessive eye for detail might one day receive an anonymous package. Inside is a paradox, a map of a city that never existed, a page from a diary written in a language no one has ever seen, or a financial ledger where the numbers balance perfectly but describe an impossible transaction. Most would dismiss it as a prank or a work of fiction, but a select few, the ones with the right kind of mind, would find themselves utterly consumed by it. The paradox would burrow into their thoughts, keeping them awake at night. This obsession is the test. It is not about solving the puzzle, but about being unable to let it go. Those who demonstrate this specific form of intellectual fixation are the ones who receive a second, more direct communication. They are, in essence, a cabinet of ghosts advising a lineage of powerful figures. Their currency is information, their weapon is foresight, and their signature is a perfectly executed anomaly. They advised Roman emperors, whispered in the ears of Medici princes, and now they were working with Napoleon Bonaparte. He was the perfect instrument for them, a man of immense power, unbound by traditional morality, with enough ambition to be willing to gamble an empire for a chance to reshape reality. He wasn't their puppet, he was their partner, a willing participant in a project of breathtaking scale. But the real question remained. For a structure like this to function within Napoleon's inner circle, it needed more than just a willing emperor. It needed an agent embedded deep within the court. A man who could translate their grand, abstract designs into the messy reality of politics. Who was this handler? Your search for the handler, the human interface between the ethereal shadow cabinet and the brute force of Napoleon's will, brings you to a figure who is himself a ghost of sorts, a man who haunted the halls of power for 50 years shape-shifting. His allegiances to survive the most violent political purges in modern history. You are searching for a man with the trust of an emperor, the mind of a philosopher, and the conscience of an assassin. The name materializes in your research, not with a sudden discovery, but with a growing sense of inevitability. Charles Maurice de Talleyrand Périgord, the limping bishop, the revolutionary aristocrat, the prince of diplomats. You are now in his Parisian salon, a world away from the battlefield. The air is warm, perfumed, and filled with the low hum of calculated gossip. Here, wars are not won with cannons, but with a well-timed whisper, a raised eyebrow, a carefully crafted insult disguised as a compliment. And at the center of this web sits Talleyrand, his face an impassive mask, his clubfoot resting on a velvet stool. This is the verifiable fact that grounds your investigation. Talleyrand served as foreign minister under Napoleon from 1799 to 1807, a period that precisely covers the Louisiana Purchase and the imperial coronation. He was not just an observer, he was the architect of Napoleon's foreign policy during these pivotal years. History paints him as the ultimate opportunist, a man whose only true loyalty was to his own survival and enrichment. His famous retort, "Treason, sir, is a matter of dates," is often cited as proof of his cynical nature. But you are looking past this caricature. From the perspective of the shadow cabinet, Talleyrand's character is not a flaw, it is a qualification. It is the perfect camouflage. His legendary greed and duplicity made his motivations seem transparently selfish, distracting everyone from his true, deeper agenda. You begin to analyze his psychology not as a traitor, but as a man playing a game on a higher board. His loyalty was not to France, nor to Napoleon, nor to the monarchy he would later help restore. His loyalty was to the grand historical equation of balance. He was not just a member of the shadow cabinet. Conclude he was one of its highest-ranking operatives, perhaps even a martyr, a master of the game. It was Talleyrand who held the reins of the Louisiana Purchase negotiations. While the earnest American diplomats Robert Livingston and James Monroe believed they were dealing with Napoleon's volatile temperament, their every move was being anticipated and manipulated by Talleyrand. He was the puppeteer. The trembling hands of Barbe Marboux were not from anxiety over the deal, but from the terror of acting as a frontman for a man like Talleyrand. It was Talleyrand who could ensure the broken Ouroboros symbol was pressed into the paper of a specific payment addendum. Knowing it would be filed away and ignored for centuries, a perfect, time-delayed message, this leads you to the peculiar methodology of his communication with the organization. It wouldn't be anything as crude as a coded letter. Talleyrand's methods were psychological, woven into his very being. You uncover whispers of a conversational cipher he employed. In his official diplomatic correspondence, he would embed messages not in what he wrote, but in what he didn't. A report on negotiations with Austria might conspicuously omit any mention of the Habsburg family's financial status. A glaring hole that, to an initiated reader, would signal a specific warning or instruction. It was a cipher of negative space, its meaning derived from context and deliberate omission. In person, his communication was even stranger. It was said he could convey an entire strategic plan through the cadence of a single sentence. The choice of one synonym over another, or a seemingly random classical allusion dropped into a dinner conversation. It was utterly brilliant and completely deniable, the perfect tool for a man living a double life in plain sight. You could now see his role with chilling clarity. He saw Napoleon's boundless ambition not as a threat, but as a uniquely powerful tool. He could aim Napoleon like a weapon at the instabilities of the world, all while the emperor believed he was acting of his own accord. Tallien was the one who could translate the shadow cabinet's abstract temporal coordinates, the star charts encoded on the coronation mantelint, to concrete political action. He guided Napoleon, he contained him, and when necessary, he would betray him. Not for personal gain, but to keep the grander plan on course. His actions were not treason. They were course corrections on a cosmic scale, but the real question remained. If Talleyrand was the master architect of this exchange, using Napoleon as the muscle, and the Louisiana Territory as the currency, what exactly was he helping Napoleon acquire? What priceless object was worth a continent? Your investigation now pivots across the Atlantic, leaving the decadent, perfumed salons of Paris for the rustic, intellectual austerity of Monticello. You are standing in the private study of Thomas Jefferson, third President of the United States. The room is a testament to his polymath mind. Scientific instruments line the shelves next to books on philosophy, architecture, and agriculture. Jefferson is a man of the Enlightenment, a believer in reason, order, and the power of empirical observation. He is a meticulous record keeper, a man who documents everything from weather patterns to the contents of the local market. It is this obsessive need for data, this unyielding faith in the knowable world, that makes his reaction to the Louisiana Purchase so compelling. Publicly, the deal is his crowning achievement. His letters to his cabinet and to Congress are filled with triumphant language about securing an empire for liberty. This is the verifiable history. In 1803, Jefferson's America was a fragile, adolescent nation, and he had just, through shrewd diplomacy and a bit of luck, doubled its size without firing a single shot. The official narrative is one of unblemished success. But as you sift through his private correspondence, the document's not meant for public consumption. A different psychological portrait emerges. You sense a deep, quiet anxiety beneath the public pronouncements of victory. The deal was too easy. The price was too low. Napoleon Bonaparte, the most formidable and ambitious man in Europe, had simply given up an empire for a fraction of its worth. To a mind like Jefferson's, an event without a logical and proportionate cause is not a miracle, it is a warning sign. It is a variable in an equation that doesn't compute. You are now holding a facsimile of a classified letter, one written not to a political ally, but to his trusted personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis. In the months leading up to the famed Lewis and Clark expedition, the letter is not written in plain English. To protect its contents, Jefferson used a device of his own invention, the wheel cipher, or as it's sometimes called, the Jefferson disk. It's a beautifully complex and bizarre piece of cryptography, a set of 26 wooden wheels, each with the alphabet inscribed in a jumbled order, all threaded onto a single axle. A message is spelled out along one line, and any of the other 25 lines of gibberish can be transcribed as the encrypted text. Without a second, identically ordered set of wheels, the code is virtually unbreakable. The very use of such a sophisticated personal cipher for a letter to an explorer is, in itself, a profound anomaly. You carefully decode the message, and the true purpose of the expedition snaps into focus. Jefferson's public instructions to Lewis and Clark were clear: to map the new territory, find a water route to the Pacific, document the flora, fauna, and native tribes. But this private letter contains a secret addendum to that mission. Jefferson instructs Lewis to look for things that do not belong. He uses phrases like unnatural topographies, incongruous geological markers, and symbols of non-native origin. He is not talking about Spanish forts, or French trappers. He is describing something older, something that seems to defy natural law. He tasks Louis with being not just an explorer, but a forensic investigator, searching the vast, untouched wilderness for the fingerprints of the invisible hand he sensed behind the deal. Jefferson, from his time as minister to France, knew Talleyrand. He distrusted him implicitly, viewing him as the epitome of corrupt old-world intrigue. You realize Jefferson suspected that the Louisiana Purchase was a poisoned gift. He couldn't refuse that the political and strategic benefits were too immense. But he was deeply suspicious of the strings he couldn't see. He was a scientist confronted with what felt like magic, and his only recourse was to collect data. The Lewis and Clark expedition was therefore transformed. It was no longer just a journey of discovery. It was a mission of counterintelligence, a 2-year, 8,000-mile reconnaissance into territory that he suspected was now spiritually, if not politically, compromised. He was looking for the mark of the shadow cabinet, the physical evidence of the price Napoleon had really paid. He believed the answer lay somewhere in the soil of the continent he had just acquired. But the real question remained. While Jefferson dispatched Louis to search the physical land for answers, did he ever suspect that the true payment wasn't delivered in a territory, but on a single, priceless piece of paper? Jefferson's search was doomed from the start. While his explorers were pushing through the unforgiving wilderness of the American West, looking for anomalies in the soil and the rocks, the real object of the transaction was being quietly removed from a shelf thousands of miles away. Your investigation now leads you back to France, to the Château de Malmaison, the intimate country home of Napoleon and Josephine. You're in Napoleon's private library, a sanctuary of mahogany and leather, where the future emperor stored the intellectual arsenal for his conquest of Europe. This room was his mind made manifest, ordered, strategic, and filled with the accumulated knowledge of the world. Here is the verifiable fact that anchors you in this space. Napoleon was a bibliophile of ferocious intensity. He traveled with a portable library on his campaigns and commissioned monumental works of scholarship, the most famous being the Description de l'Egypte, a comprehensive multi-volume catalog of Egyptian civilization. He didn't just read books, he consumed them, weaponized them. His personal librarian, Antoine Alexandre Barbier, is tasked with organizing this vast collection, curating not just a library, but a database of global power and influence. Every book, every atlas, every folio had its place. Nothing was ever lost. Nothing was ever out of order. And that is why the librarian's discovery sends a jolt of cold fear through you. It is a quiet morning in late 1803. Barbier is conducting a routine inventory. He reaches for a particularly magnificent volume, an atlas folio bound in deep blue Moroccan leather, embossed with Napoleon's personal crest. It is part of a set commissioned by Napoleon himself, intended to be the definitive cartographic record of the world under French influence. This specific folio is titled simply Territoires de l'Ouest, Western Territories. As Barbier lifts the heavy volume, he notices it feels subtly wrong, lighter than it should be. With a growing sense of dread, he lays it on a table and opens the cover. The silk end papers are perfect. The first dozen plates showing detailed charts of the Caribbean and the North Atlantic coast are all present. But then he comes to a gap. In the very center of the volume, where the centerpiece map should be, there is nothing. Just a carefully cut stub of vellum, no thicker than a fingernail, showing where a page has been expertly excised. The binding has been restitched with such skill that the tampering is almost invisible. This was not a crude act of theft. This was surgery. There was no sign of a break-in, no report of a security breach. The folio had been removed from the shelf, taken to a private room, operated on by a master, and then replaced. All within the most secure residence in France, besides the Tuileries Palace itself. This leads you to the bizarre signature of the shadow cabinet. Left between the pages, where the missing map once lay, is a single sheet of paper. It is a blank piece of vellum, identical in size and quality to the map it replaced. It contains no writing, no symbol, no mark of any kind. Utterly blank. Barbier holds it up to the candlelight, his hands trembling slightly. It is only then that he sees it, a watermark pressed into the fibers, visible only when backlit. It is not the Ouroboros this time. It is a single, stylized, unblinking eye. A silent, chilling declaration. It says, "We have taken what is ours. The transaction is complete. This space is now a void, a testament to what you have given up." This isn't just a calling card. It's a psychological tool, a permanent reminder of the unseen forces Napoleon is now indebted to. When Napoleon is informed, his reaction is not the volcanic rage his staff expects. There is no shouting, no objects thrown across the room. Witnesses would later describe a terrifying stillness that fell over him. He dismisses his librarian, walks to the atlas, and stares at the empty space. He understands. This was the final payment. The Louisiana Purchase wasn't the deal. It was just the elaborate distraction to facilitate the real transfer. He had publicly sold a physical territory he couldn't control to acquire victories he desperately needed. But in private, he had just handed over a piece of information so valuable that a shadow organization, one that deals in epochs and civilizations, considered it a fair trade for a continent. He had traded a map for a miracle. The world saw a brilliant diplomat in Jefferson and a pragmatic financier in Napoleon. The truth was that Jefferson had bought a piece of land, while Napoleon had sold a key to reality itself. But the real question remained. If this map was not a chart of rivers and mountains, and its value exceeded that of 828,000 square miles of territory, what in God's name did it actually show? The question hangs in the cold air of your imagination. What did the map actually show? The answer defies every convention of cartography you have ever known. You are now attempting to visualize an object that exists outside the normal bounds of human understanding. Piecing together its nature from the echoes it left behind, a hollow space in a priceless atlas, the unnerving calm of an emperor, and the secret anxieties of a president. The artifact Napoleon acquired was not a map of land, was not a guide to buried treasure or a strategic layout of enemy fortifications. It was a map of causality, a chart of consequences. It did not show rivers, mountains, and borders. It showed moments, decisions, and destinies. This was the ultimate tool for a man like Napoleon Bonaparte. His entire life was a study in the exploitation of moments. At the siege of Toulon, he saw the tactical importance of a single hill that everyone else had overlooked. During his Italian campaign, he moved his armies with a speed that seemed to defy logistics, always arriving at the decisive point at the decisive time. He had an innate, almost supernatural intuition for the fulcrums of history, the small hinges on which great doors swing. To a man with such a mind, a map that laid out these fulcrums with scientific precision would be the equivalent of a holy grail. It was the final variable he needed to control, not just the battlefield, but the very flow of events. It transformed him from a master strategist into something more. He could now see the source code of reality. You must ground this concept in the mundane reality of his time. The verifiable fact is that in 1803, Napoleon was assembling the Armée des Côtes de l'Ocean, the Army of the Ocean Coasts, at the port of Boulogne. Over 200,000 men were gathered for the grand project, the invasion and conquest of England. This was his public obsession, the great endeavor that consumed the attention of all of Europe. But as he stood on the French coast, staring across the gray waters of the English Channel, his mind was on a different kind of navigation. While his generals planned troop movements and naval logistics, Napoleon was contemplating the currents of time itself. The invasion of England was a grand problem, but the map in his possession offered solutions to problems of an entirely different magnitude. The organization you have been tracking, the Shadow Cabinet, were not cartographers of place, but of fate. You can now begin to visualize their masterwork. The map was not made of paper or vellum. It was a sheet of a strange, flexible material, cool to the touch and unnaturally smooth, that seemed to absorb the light around it. The lines on its surface were not drawn with ink. They appeared to be infinitesimally fine filaments of an unknown substance, woven into the fabric of the material, that shimmered with a faint internal luminescence. The geography it displayed was abstract, a complex lattice of pathways and nodes that looked less like a continent and more like a diagram of a cosmic nervous system. And here you uncover its most bizarre and essential quality. The map was not read with the eyes alone. It required a form of cognitive resonance. To an ordinary person, the shimmering lines would be a meaningless, chaotic web. But to a mind attuned to its frequency, a mind like Napoleon's, or one trained by the shadow cabinet, the map came alive. As you focused on a particular pathway, a timeline, the filaments would respond. Stable, probable histories were represented by calm, steady lines. Timelines that led to ruin or stagnation would pulse with a sickly, dissonant light. But the most critical points, the nodes where a single action could cause the timeline to branch into vastly different outcomes, blazed with a brilliant, almost blinding white light. These were the turning points, the pivot moments that the cartographers of fates, as you now call them, dedicated themselves to monitoring. The map was their most sacred object, a tool for perceiving the architecture of destiny. They did not create it. They were its custodians, and they had just loaned it to Napoleon Bonaparte. They saw in his relentless ambition a force of nature that could be aimed. For a short time, at a specific problem in the grand equation of history, he thought he was getting the ultimate weapon to secure his empire. They knew they were giving him a specific tool for a single vital task. He was a scalpel, and they were guiding his hand to make a precise incision in the past. But the real question remained. Now that Napoleon possessed this divine perspective, this God's-eye view of history's weak points, which specific shining node on the map would he target first? What victory was so essential that it was worth the price of an entire continent? With the map of causality in his possession, Napoleon is no longer merely a general. He's a force of nature with a weather chart. The abstract understanding of the map's power now demands a concrete application, a test case on the grandest possible scale. Your focus shifts to the autumn of 1805. The planned invasion of England is abandoned. The political landscape of Europe has convulsed once again. The Third Coalition, a formidable alliance of Britain, Russia, and Austria, has formed against him. Napoleon's Grand Armée, once poised to cross the Channel, now wheels around and marches east with breathtaking speed. He is outnumbered, operating deep in enemy territory and facing the combined might of two ancient empires. To any conventional military analyst, his situation is precarious, bordering on disastrous. You are in his campaign tent on the eve of December 2nd, 1805, near the town of Austerlitz, in what is now the Czech Republic. The air is frigid and a damp, oppressive fog clings to the landscape. This is the verifiable stage for his masterpiece, the Battle of Austerlitz, forever known as the Battle of the Three Emperors. Before him stand Tsar Alexander I of Russia and Holy Roman Emperor Francis II. Confident in their superior numbers and their supposedly brilliant strategic plan, the historical record shows Napoleon as a master of deception, brilliantly feigning weakness to lure his opponents into a fatal trap. But you know the truth is colder and more profound. He is not gambling. He is following a script. On the simple campaign table in front of him, the map lies open. It is not the familiar terrain map his marshals are studying. It is the shimmering, abstract web of causality. He is not looking at the topography of the Pratzen Heights or the frozen ponds to the south. He is looking at the very structure of his enemy's confidence. The map does not show him where the Russian guard is positioned. It shows him the precise frequency of the Tsar's arrogance. It is not a tool of geography. It is a tool of psychological warfare on a level no human has ever wielded before. This is the bizarre, intimate way the map functions. It resonates with the collective consciousness of the opposing army, allowing Napoleon to perceive their thoughts, not as words, but as patterns of energy-brittle lines of overconfidence, chaotic nodes of internal disagreement between the Russian and Austrian commands, and one glaring, incandescent point of weakness. The map shows him that the Allied plan to turn his right flank is not just a probability, it is an inevitability, born of their contempt for his seemingly vulnerable position. He doesn't have to guess their strategy, feels it as a certainty, so he leans into it. He deliberately weakens his right flank under Marshal Davout, making the bait so tantalizing it is impossible to resist. He positions Marshal Soult's corps in the center, hidden by the fog and the terrain, ready to strike the decisive blow. This is not intuition, it is execution. The famous sun of Austerlitz, which broke through the fog that morning to reveal the Allied armies descending from the Pratzen Heights and marching straight into his trap, was not a moment of lucky weather. It was the moment a pre-calculated equation solved itself. As Soult's forces stormed the vacated heights, splitting the Allied army in two and shattering their chain of command, you witnessed the battle. Not as a chaotic clash of men, but as the elegant, brutal collapse of a flawed system. The victory is absolute, a work of art so perfect it seems to have been divinely ordained. In a single day, the Third Coalition is annihilated. The Holy Roman Empire, a political entity that had existed for 1,000 years, is dissolved in its aftermath. Napoleon is no longer just a French emperor. He is the undisputed master of Europe. But as you observe him in the moments after the battle, you don't see the ecstatic joy of a gambler who has won it all. You see the cold, detached satisfaction of a craftsman who has followed a blueprint perfectly. The thrill is gone. The victory was guaranteed. This was the first great payment drawn from the account opened by the Louisiana Purchase. The shadow cabinet had provided the tool, and he had used it to achieve the impossible. The deal was real. The power was absolute. But as Napoleon stands on the blood-soaked snow of the Pratzen Heights, the map's faint shimmer seems to dim slightly. An invisible ledger has been updated. A colossal expenditure of causal energy has been made to ensure this perfect outcome. The laws of the universe and of the organization that polices them demand balance. A victory this flawless, this reality-altering, creates a debt. It was a spectacular success, solidifying his empire and rewriting the map of Europe. He had paid for it in advance with a continent, but the real question remained. What future concession, what catastrophic failure, would now be required of him to balance the cosmic scales and pay the interest on this impossible victory? The godlike high of Austerlitz has faded, replaced by the cold, heavy certainty of debt. A victory that perfect was not a conquest. It was a loan from an entity that does not deal in forgiveness. You understand that, Napoleon, in the quiet moments after the celebrations have ended, must be grappling with this terrifying new reality? The map of causality is a weapon of unimaginable power, but it is not a gift. It is one half of a complex mechanism. The other half, the instruction manual and the terms of service, is something else entirely. It is an object that requires not strategic genius, but a completely different kind of perception. Your investigation now turns to a small, almost forgotten artifact that holds the key to the entire bargain. You are now in the manuscript room of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. All around you are the collected thoughts of centuries, bound in leather and preserved in climate-controlled stillness. You are looking for a specific item, catalogued under a misleading title, MSFR 147. Recalda, Geometry Esoteric, Collection of Esoteric Geometry. This is your verifiable anchor. National libraries around the world are filled with such oddities, unclassifiable texts, untranslated codices like the Voynich manuscript, documents that sit on the edge of reason. This particular scroll is officially dismissed as the work of a mystical numerologist or a failed alchemist from the late 17th century. It is a roll of fine vellum, about the width of a man's hand, covered in script so dense and intricate it appears almost like a textile pattern from a distance. As you zoom in on high-resolution scans, you see that it is not a language at all. There are no letters, no runes, no hieroglyphs. It is a continuous, unbroken stream of microscopic geometric forms. Some resemble snowflakes, others cellular structures, others fractal patterns that seem to contain infinite detail. The pattern evolves along the length of the scroll, as if telling a story through the mutation of form. This is the vellum cipher, and its defense is not complexity, but paradox. Any attempt to analyze it with mathematics or computational force fails. The patterns seem to shift, to reconfigure themselves, eluding any logical system meant to pin them down. It is a code that actively resists being cracked. This is the bizarre, almost living nature of the Shadow Cabinet's technology. The secret to this uncrackable code is what makes it so brilliant and so terrifying. The key is not a physical object or a set of rules. It is a specific state of human consciousness. To read the vellum cipher, the user must engage in a unique psychological discipline. You cannot think your way through it. You must stop thinking. You must stare at a section of the flowing, impossible geometry until the rational mind, in its desperate attempt to find a pattern, gives up. It's a forced meditation, an intellectual surrender. You must hold a paradox in your mind, the paradox of a pattern that is clearly intentional, but logically incomprehensible till the ego dissolves. Only in that state of pure, thoughtless awareness does the cipher yield its secrets. The geometric forms cease to be visuals and are translated directly into the mind as pure concepts. There is no reading, only knowing. You can now picture Napoleon, the man of action, of iron will, and relentless ego, being forced into this passive meditative state. He must sit in a quiet room, his marshals waiting outside, and stare at this impossible scroll. He must silence the part of him that wants to conquer, to command, to understand. He has to unmake himself to read the terms of his own deal. And in that moment of surrender, the truth of his bargain flows into him. He understands the principle of balance. He sees that his victory at Austerlitz, a monumental disruption of the timeline, created an equal and opposite void. The universe, as policed by the cartographers of fates, demands equilibrium. The cipher explains it to him in cold, conceptual terms. The energy he borrowed to guarantee that victory must be repaid with a failure of equal magnitude. The map can show him how to win, but the vellum contract explains that he must also use it to lose. It lays out the nature of his future obligations, a series of strategic defeats, each one carefully chosen and precisely executed to bleed off the temporal instability created by his successes. He is not just an emperor. He is now a tool for cosmic regulation, tasked with managing his own decline. The power to win any battle comes at the price of knowing exactly which battles he is contractually obligated to lose and when. He has seen the path to godhood and has learned that the price is a carefully managed suicide. But the real question remained. As this horrifying knowledge settles into his mind, how does a man whose entire identity is forged in the fire of victory begin to psychologically prepare himself to orchestrate his own most spectacular and humiliating defeat? The vellum cipher has made the terms brutally clear. The debt incurred at Austerlitz must be repaid with a failure of equal opposing force. But such a monumental transaction, the formal agreement to leverage the timeline in exchange for a future, calculated disaster, cannot be sealed with a mere mental understanding. The shadow cabinet, in your analysis, operates with a sense of ritual that borders on the theatrical. Their agreements require a physical location, a sanctified space where the abstract principles of their philosophy can be grounded in the physical world. Your investigation now searches for a place that fits their unique signature, remote, inaccessible, and imbued with a significance that transcends ordinary human history. You are no longer on a battlefield or in a library. You are ascending a treacherous path high in the Grayan Alps, the air growing thin and cold. The landscape is brutally minimalist gray rock, blue ice, and a sky so clear it feels like a void. This is a place where the world feels stripped down to its essential elements. Your destination is a specific, obscure peak on the border between France and what was then the Kingdom of Sardinia. This is your verifiable fact. Napoleon, an avid and skilled mountaineer, made several lesser-known crossings of the Alps, not just the famous one at the Great St. Bernard Pass. These smaller expeditions were often undertaken with minimal entourage, officially documented as topographical surveys or personal excursions for health. You realize these were not leisure trips. They were appointments. Near the summit of this remote peak, nestled in a place shielded from the punishing winds, is a man-made structure that appears on no map. It is not a fortress or a cabin. It is an observatory, but it is not built to observe the stars. The structure is ancient, built from massive, seamlessly joined blocks of granite that seem to have been fused rather than mortared. Its design is bizarrely anachronistic, combining elements of Roman engineering with astronomical alignments that suggest a pre-Roman, possibly Etruscan or even older, origin.
Wow.
This is a place that has been used by the cartographers of fates for millennia. It is a nexus point, a place where the veil between the physical world and the deeper, causal structure of reality is unusually thin. You can now visualize the meeting. It is not a negotiation. The terms are already set. It is a ratification ceremony. Napoleon arrives accompanied only by a single trusted guide who quietly disappears upon arrival. He is met not by a committee, but by a solitary figure. It is Talleyrand. But the Talleyrand he meets here is not the unctuous, scheming court politician. Here, in this sacred place, he is stripped of his public persona. He is Mater, a master of the order, his limp and cynical demeanor replaced by an aura of immense ancient authority. He is not Napoleon's servant. He is his spiritual accountant. Inside the observatory there is no furniture. The circular chamber is dominated by a single object, a shallow, concave dish of polished obsidian, 10 feet in diameter, set into the floor. It looks like a mirror of black water. This is the quirky, almost ritualistic technology they employ. The obsidian dish is not a screen. It is a resonance amplifier. When Napoleon stands before it, the map of causality, which he carries with him, begins to vibrate at a low frequency. Talleyrand prompts him to focus his mind on the concept of the debt, the catastrophic failure he must orchestrate. As he does, the obsidian dish comes to life. The shimmering lines of the map are projected onto its black surface. Not as light, but as swirling patterns of kinetic energy, like ripples in a pond. He has shown the target for his repayment. He sees the node representing his 1805 victory at Austerlitz, blazing with a blinding white light. Then, he watches as Talleyrand points to another part of the map, a dark, chaotic cluster of pathways years in the future. As Napoleon's mind is guided to focus on it, that dark node begins to glow with a sickly negative light. It is the invasion of Russia, 1812. The map doesn't show him troop movements or supply lines. It shows him the brutal, elegant simplicity of the required failure. An army of 500,000. Men marching into a void swallowed by a landscape defeated not by an enemy army, but by the elemental forces of winter and distance. It is the perfect counterbalance to Austerlitz. A victory over 2 emperors, achieved through tactical genius. Repaid with a defeat at the hands of General Winter, a force beyond military control. This allows him to save face, to frame the disaster as a struggle against nature, not a failure of his own making. It is the perfect theatrical lie. Standing in the cold, thin air of the Alpine Observatory, Napoleon gives his assent. He formally accepts the burden of orchestrating the greatest military disaster in modern history. The deal is sealed. He has used the map to become the master of Europe. Now he must use it to begin the long, carefully managed process of his own destruction. But the real question remained. In an organization so concerned with ritual and physical commitment, what strange binding act would be required to formalize this pact? To turn a mental agreement into an unbreakable physical bond, the silent assent in the Alpine Observatory is not enough. For the cartographers of fates, a pact that alters the course of history cannot be sealed with a mere nod or a handshake. Their philosophy dictates that a commitment of this magnitude must be anchored in the physical world through a biological signature, a binding that is both deeply personal and symbolically potent. The agreement must become part of Napoleon's very being. Your analysis now delves into the strange, almost pseudo-scientific rituals that underpin the Shadow Cabinet's most solemn agreements. Moving from the grand scale of geopolitics to the microscopic level of human biology, you are back in the sterile, cold interior of the ancient observatory. The projection on the obsidian dish has faded, leaving only the polished black surface. The abstract nature of the deal, the repayment of a temporal debt through a future, orchestrated catastrophe, must now be made concrete. Talleyrand, acting in his capacity as motor, produces a small, intricately carved wooden box. He opens it to reveal a peculiar set of instruments that look like a cross between a surgeon's toolkit and an alchemist's apparatus. They are made of a dark, non-reflective metal you don't recognize. There is a small, razor-sharp obsidian scalpel, a crystal vial containing a clear, viscous liquid, and a thin, hollow needle, made of what appears to be spun gold. This is where you connect to a verifiable, if often overlooked, historical detail. Napoleon had a lifelong aversion to doctors and medical procedures. He distrusted them, viewing their practices as crude and ineffective. He famously resisted seeking medical advice even when his health was clearly failing. For a man with such a deeply ingrained phobia, to submit to what comes next reveals the absolute power this pact held over him. He understood its necessity, and the fear of the procedure was secondary to the fear of breaking his agreement with the custodians of the timeline. The ritual is precise, methodical, and deeply bizarre. First, Talleyrand uses the obsidian scalpel to take a small cutting from a lock of Napoleon's hair. This is the symbol of his identity, his public persona, the part of him that belongs to the world. He places the hair into the crystal vial. Next, using the same scalpel with unnerving precision, he makes a tiny incision on the tip of Napoleon's index finger. A single drop of blood wells up, dark and rich. This is the symbol of his life force, his biological essence, the part of him that is purely his own. Using the hollow golden needle, Talleyrand draws up the single drop of blood. The final step of the ritual is the binding. The drop of blood is not added to the vial. Instead, Talleyrand takes the vellum cipher, the scroll containing the terms of the contract, and unrolls it to a specific pre-marked section. He then expels the drop of blood from the golden needle directly onto one of the intricate geometric patterns on the vellum. For a moment, the blood sits on the surface like a tiny ruby. Then, in an act that defies chemistry, the vellum absorbs it completely. The geometric pattern where the blood was placed glows with a faint crimson light for a few seconds before returning to its normal state. The contract is now biologically signed. His DNA, his very life essence, is now woven into the fabric of the agreement. It is no longer just a deal, it is a part of him. Meanwhile, the lock of hair in the vial is mixed with the clear liquid. The hair dissolves not through a chemical reaction, but by dematerializing, leaving the liquid in the vial completely clear once more. This vial is Napoleon's escrow. It is his collateral, held by the shadow cabinet. It is a symbolic representation of his public life, his empire, his glory, all of which is now forfeit if he breaks the pact. The ritual is complete. A lock of hair represents the empire he will sacrifice. A drop of blood represents the life he has sworn to the cause. He has physically and spiritually bound himself to the task of orchestrating his own downfall. The psychological weight of this act must have been immense. He is no longer just a man playing a role. The role is now part of his genetic code. But the real question remained. As he descended from the silent, icy peak of the Alps, carrying the chilling certainty of his mission, how would he begin to lay the practical groundwork for the greatest military disaster of his age? The descent from the Alpine peak is a descent into a new kind of existence. You are observing a man who is now hollowed out, his personal ambition replaced by the cold, heavy machinery of contractual obligation. He is no longer Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French. He is an agent of cosmic balance, a high-level functionary for the cartographers of fates. The world still sees the strategic genius, the force of will, but you see the actor playing his most difficult role. His life from this point forward is a performance, a grand deception enacted upon the world stage. His task, to meticulously plan and execute the single greatest military catastrophe of the 19th century, all while appearing to do everything in his power to achieve victory. Years pass. The map of causality lies dormant, its power held in reserve. The vellum cipher is locked away, its biological signature a constant, silent reminder of the pact. Then the time comes. 1812. The note on the map that glowed with a dark negative energy in the observatory now dominates his private thoughts. His public pretext is the SR's withdrawal from the continental system, a trade dispute that provides a convenient casus belli. His marshals, men like Ney, Devout, and Murat, are energized, ready for another glorious campaign. They see only the challenge of defeating Russia, cannot see that their master's objective is not to defeat Russia, but to sacrifice their own army upon its altar. This is where you witnessed his genius inverted. You are present in the planning rooms at the Tuileries Palace. The verifiable historical fact is the sheer scale of the undertaking. Napoleon assembles the Grande Armée. It's the largest European army in history, a multinational force of over 680,000 men. To his staff, this is a demonstration of overwhelming power, a force so massive it cannot possibly be defeated. You, however, recognize it as the first and most critical act of self-sabotage. An army of that size is a logistical serpent that will inevitably devour itself. It cannot be supplied by foraging in the sparsely populated, agriculturally poor lands of Western Russia. Napoleon, the master of logistics who once said an army marches on its stomach, knows this better than anyone. He listens to the concerns of his quartermasters, nods gravely, and then overrides them. It is not arrogance, is deliberate, calculated malpractice. The bizarre mechanism of his sabotage is his use of the map. In the dead of night, in the privacy of his tent, you see him consulting the shimmering web, not to find the enemy's weaknesses, but to identify and amplify his own. The map confirms the Russian strategy of infinite retreat. It shows him that the enemy commanders, Barclay de Tolly and later Kutuzov, will refuse to give him the decisive battle he craves. It highlights the timeline where his own supply lines become fatally overstretched, where his horses die for lack of fodder, where disease rips through his ranks long before the first snowflake falls. And he steers his army directly into this timeline, pushes them forward, faster, deeper into the vast emptiness of Russia, chasing a ghost army he knows he will never catch. He is not leading an invasion. He is managing a controlled demolition. The climax of this performance is the arrival at a deserted Moscow. He finds a hollow capital, a prize with no value, and he waits. When the fires begin, set by Russian patriots, his marshals are aghast. They see the destruction of their winter quarters, the ruin of their campaign. Napoleon, however, watches the ancient city burn with a chilling, detached calm. This is not a surprise. It is the fulfillment of a prophecy he read on the map. It is the great pyrotechnic spectacle that will signal to the shadow cabinet that the debt is being paid. The victory at Austerlitz, symbolized by a rising sun, is now balanced by the burning of Moscow, an inferno consuming his ambition. The cosmic equation is being solved in flames. The retreat is the horrific, drawn-out conclusion of the project. His army, starved, frozen, and harassed by Cossacks, dissolves into a desperate rabble. He has successfully sacrificed 500,000 men. He has offered up the greatest army of his age to the merciless gods of winter and distance. He has fulfilled the core term of his pact. To the world, it is the beginning of his end, a catastrophic blunder born of hubris. But in the cold calculus of the cartographers of fates, it is a staggering success, a temporal debt repaid in full. But the real question remained. Now that the scales were balanced, was this simply about resetting a cosmic ledger? Or was this colossal sacrifice merely the first step in clearing the board for an even more audacious, more complex maneuver? The colossal failure in the Russian snows has balanced the cosmic ledger. The debt for Austerlitz is paid in the frozen bodies of the Grande Armée, but you understand now that this was never about a simple accounting of wins and losses. The sacrifice of 1812 was not an end. It was a necessary clearing of the board, a controlled demolition to prepare the ground for a new, far more intricate construction. Your focus now shifts to a small, sun-drenched island in the Mediterranean. The year is 1814. The master of Europe has fallen. The world breathes a collective sigh of relief. You are on the island of Elba. The air is warm, scented with salt and myrtle. Napoleon, by the terms of the Treaty of Fontainebleau, has been granted sovereignty over this tiny kingdom of 12,000 inhabitants. This is the verifiable historical fact. He is not a prisoner in a cell, but a monarch in miniature. He retains the title of emperor, a personal guard of several hundred loyal soldiers, and a small navy. The Allied powers have placed him in a gilded cage, believing the humiliation of ruling an island of iron mines and fishing villages would be enough to contain the most explosive force of the age. They see it as a merciful, if slightly anxious, retirement. You, however, see it as a staging ground. Observing his daily routine, you see a masterful performance of frustrated decline. He busies himself with Elba's affairs, designing new roads, reorganizing the mines, and holding court in a modest palace. He plays the role of the caged lion perfectly pacing board, occasionally showing flashes of his old brilliance in arguments over municipal budgets. His official watchers, the British Commissioner Sir Neil Campbell, report back to their governments that the emperor is growing fat, listless, and resigned to his fate. But you see through the charade. This is not the lethargy of defeat. It is the focused stillness of a predator waiting in a blind. His mind is not on Elba's iron mines, which is on the map of causality which he still possesses. And on the next phase of the plan, dictated by the vellum cipher, the signal comes not in a coded letter or a secret messenger, but through one of the shadow cabinet's characteristically bizarre methods. It leverages the island's own unique properties. Elba has been famous since antiquity for its rich iron ore deposits. The ground itself is magnetic. One evening, Napoleon is in his study, examining a nautical compassa, mundane object for any island ruler. But on this night, the needle doesn't quiver and point north. It swings with unnatural certainty and locks onto a point on the Italian mainland. It holds that position for precisely 1 hour, then swings back to magnetic north as if nothing had happened. This is not a magnetic anomaly. It is a broadcast. It is a highly specific, untraceable activation signal. It is the Motors telling him, the time is now. Your deployment window is open. His escape on February 26, 1815. It's a masterpiece of choreography, presented to the world as a daring adventure. The historical record notes that the guard ships, both British and French, were conveniently absent or looking the other way. Sir Neil Campbell himself was away on the mainland. It is dismissed as a comical lapse in security. See it for what it is, a deliberately open door. The seas were calm, the winds were favorable, and Napoleon sailed away from his miniature kingdom without a single shot being fired. He was not escaping. He was being redeployed. His famous 100 Days return was not a desperate gamble to reclaim his empire. That was the cover story, the brilliant theatrical narrative that he himself authored and the world eagerly consumed. The true purpose was far more complex. He was acting as a human magnet, a living catalyst. His return to France was designed to do one thing with absolute certainty: to remobilize the armies of Europe and force them to converge on a single, predetermined location. The sacrifice in Russia had reset the timeline's balance. Now, he was being used to gather all the key players onto one stage for a final, reality-altering event. He was not trying to win a war. He was setting a very specific and very important appointment. The kings and emperors of Europe, believing they were responding to a renewed threat, were unwittingly marching their armies to a location chosen for them by the cartographers of fates. But the real question remained. If his return was not about reclaiming power but about setting a stage, what unimaginable event was scheduled to take place at the battle he was so carefully engineering? The redeployment from Elba has worked to perfection. Europe is in a state of controlled panic. Armies that had been demobilizing are now marching again. The kings and generals who thought they had put the Napoleonic genie back in the bottle are now scrambling, their every move dictated by the reappearance of one man. You are now in the fields of Belgium, near a small, unremarkable village called Waterloo. It is June 18, 1815. The air is heavy with humidity, the ground soaked from a torrential downpour the previous night. This is the stage meticulously set for the final act of Napoleon's contract. The verifiable history of the Battle of Waterloo is a litany of what-ifs and if-onlys. What if Marshal Grouchy hadn't gotten lost and had arrived with his 33,000 men? What if Napoleon had started the battle earlier, before the rain-soaked ground dried? What if the Prussian army under Blucher hadn't arrived at the last possible moment? Historians and military strategists have debated these points for 2 centuries, seeing them as the chaotic interplay of chance, weather, and human error. You, however, see the cold, hard gears of a machine grinding towards its intended outcome. These are not accidents. They are engineered certainties. Napoleon's objective at Waterloo is not to win. This is the fundamental, world-altering secret of the battle. His personal ambition, the desire to reclaim his throne, is the fuel for the engine, but it is not its purpose. The true goal of the battle is to create a massive, concentrated event of human conflict, a singular point in space, in time where the emotional and psychic energy of over 200,000 men is focused with maximum intensity. The battle itself is a gigantic diversion. It is a ritual sacrifice of men and materiel designed to generate a colossal amount of causal energy in one place. But for what? Your analysis uncovers the bizarre, almost unthinkable objective hidden beneath the cannon fire and cavalry charges. While the Duke of Wellington's army is pinned against the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean, and the Prussian army is racing to join the battle, a small, unnoticed operation is underway. Talleyrand, no longer in Napoleon's government, but still pulling the strings from the Congress of Vienna, has ensured that a very specific team is present near the battlefield. They are not soldiers. They are a small group of the Shadow Cabinet's specialists, a field team of cartographers. Their equipment is not weapons, but a set of portable resonance devices. Artifacts that look like oversized, intricately carved tuning forks made of the same dark metal as the instruments in the Alpine Observatory. Their destination is a small, ancient stone chapel, located a few miles from the main battlefield, a place so insignificant it is not on any military map, but it is on their map. The map of causality shows this specific chapel as a weak point, a temporal seam where the fabric of reality is thin. As the Battle of Waterloo reaches its ferocious climax as Marshal, Ney leads his heroic but doomed cavalry charges against the British squares. As the Imperial Guard makes its final, desperate advance, the psychic output of the battle reaches its peak. The raw, concentrated energy of human hope, fear, rage, and death creates a massive wave of causal distortion. The specialists at the chapel use their resonance devices to harness this wave. They are not drawing power from the battle. They are using the battle's psychic shockwave as a key to unlock something. The forks begin to vibrate, emitting a low, subaudible hum that causes the very air to shimmer. They focus the energy of the battle onto the chapel's stone altar, which begins to glow with an eerie internal light. For a brief window, lasting no more than a few minutes at the absolute peak of the fighting, a gateway is opened. It is not a gateway in space, but in time. They are using the raw brute force of the Battle of Waterloo to power a machine that allows them to make a single, precise, and untraceable edit to a past event. Napoleon's entire 100 Days campaign, his escape from Elba, his march on Paris, and the sacrifice of his final army at Waterloo was all for this. It was a massive, bloody ritual to generate the power needed to operate a temporal scalpel for a few precious moments. But the real question remained. What historical wound was so deep? What past mistake was so catastrophic that it required the orchestrated slaughter of tens of thousands of men at Waterloo to generate the power to correct it? The cannons fall silent. The smoke over the fields of Waterloo begins to clear, revealing a scene of unimaginable carnage. The last gamble has failed. The empire is gone, this time for good. For the world, the story of Napoleon Bonaparte is over, bar the final dreary postscript. But for you, the most critical phase of the operation is just beginning. The battle was the ritual, the generation of raw power. Now comes the quiet, painstaking work for which that power was harvested. Your attention shifts from the blood-soaked fields of Belgium to a remote, wind-swept rock in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, the island of St. Helena. We're on the shores of one of the most isolated places on Earth. It is a volcanic island, a speck of British territory thousands of miles from any continent. This is Napoleon's final prison, and the verifiable historical fact is that his exile here was designed to be absolute. He was a prisoner, watched day and night by hundreds of soldiers, his correspondence censored, his every move documented by the governor, Hudson Lowe. The official narrative is that this was a sad, pathetic end for a great man, a slow decline into boredom, illness, and petty squabbles with his jailer. You see this exile not as a punishment, but as the project's final, crucial stage. St. Helena was not a prison, it was a laboratory. Napoleon's captivity is the perfect cover. The intense security, the total isolation, the obsessive documentation of his life by law, of it serves to mask the true nature of his work. He is no longer an emperor, a general, or even a prisoner, a temporal technician, tasked with completing his side of the bargain. While his captors watch him dictating his memoirs and tending his garden, he is engaged in the most profound intellectual labor of his life. He is still in possession of the map of causality and the vellum cipher. The chaos of Waterloo has provided the energy, but the precise calculations for the edit to the timeline must be made by a human mind capable of holding the entire complex equation at once. That mind is his. The bizarre reality of his life on St. Helena is a study in dualities. During the day, he performs the role of the deposed tyrant, arguing with Lowe over wine rations and firewood. This mundane psychodrama consumes the attention of his guards, who meticulously record every tedious detail. At night, in the privacy of his chambers at Longwood House, the real work begins. You can see him poring over the shimmering map, which is now active in a new way. The energy from Waterloo has charged it. causing specific pathways, the timelines leading back to the wound in history, to glow with a steady, workable light. He is no longer just reading the map, he is programming it. He uses the vellum cipher as his interface. By entering into the required meditative state, he can mentally grasp a timeline on the map. His task is to trace the consequences of the historical event that needs to be altered, calculating the butterfly effect of any change with painstaking precision. He must find a way to make the correction with the absolute minimum of collateral damage to the subsequent flow of history. It is a problem of such staggering complexity that it would drive an ordinary mind to madness. But Napoleon's mind, forged in the crucible of continental warfare and now trained by the Shadow Cabinet's esoteric disciplines, is uniquely suited to the task. He spends his nights navigating the labyrinth of what-ifs, tweaking variables, running simulations in his mind, ensuring that the correction will be a clean, surgical cut, not a messy amputation. This is the St. Helena Project. His memoirs are not just a way to settle old scores and shape his legacy. They are a cover activity, a way to occupy his days while his nights are spent in this silent cosmic labor. His famous last words, France, Armée, Tite d'Armée, Josephine France, Army, head of the army, Josephine, are seen as the fevered ramblings of a dying man. But you interpret them differently. They are the key variables of his life, the focal points of the timeline he has just finished recalibrating. He is not reminiscing. He is reciting the final parameters of his completed work. Confirming the stability of the new timeline before his consciousness fades, his death in 1821 is not a release from prison. It is the moment the technician lays down his tools, his project complete. The world mourns or celebrates the death of a man. The cartographers of fates acknowledged the successful conclusion of a contract, but the real question remained. Who financed this multi-decade, continent-spanning operation, an undertaking whose costs far exceeded the treasuries of mere nations? The project is complete. Napoleon's body lies cooling in the damp air of Longwood House, his final breath a quiet punctuation mark at the end of a world-shattering sentence. The timeline has been edited, the great work finished. But as you pull back from the intimate drama of his exile, your analytical gaze broadens to encompass the sheer, logistical audacity of the entire operation. This was a project that spanned decades, crossed continents, and involved the manipulation of entire armies and nations. It required not just temporal mechanics and esoteric knowledge, but something far more mundane and brutally essential: money, an astronomical amount of it. The Louisiana Purchase, the financing of Napoleon's campaigns, the network of agents, the maintenance of secret observatories. This was an enterprise whose costs dwarfed the treasuries of the nations it manipulated. The question left hanging in the air after Napoleon's death is not about his legacy, but about his funding. Who was the invisible hand that signed the checks? Your investigation now drills down into the bedrock of 19th century power, a world where thrones and empires were increasingly dependent on the goodwill of a new kind of dynasty, the international bankers. You are no longer in a throne room, but in the back office of a counting house in London or Paris. The air smells of ledgers, ink and wealth so vast, it has become an abstraction. The verifiable historical fact that illuminates this shadow world is the rise of powerful, stateless banking families during the Napoleonic Wars. These were syndicates who operated across borders, their loyalty not to a flag, but to their network. They famously financed multiple warring nations simultaneously, profiting from the conflict itself. Their couriers and communication networks often faster and more reliable than those of any government. You see now that this was no accident. A secretive European banking syndicate, operating under various names and family crests, was not merely profiting from the Napoleonic Wars. It was the designated financial arm of the Shadow Cabinet. It was their treasury. For them, the decades of continental conflict were not a series of national struggles. They were a massive, carefully managed capital generation event. They provided the funds that allowed the armies to march, ensuring the conflicts were sustained at the necessary intensity, all while indebting the governments of Europe so deeply that their post-war sovereignty would be a polite fiction. Their ultimate goal was not profit, but control. They were transforming the chaotic energy of war into the cold, hard leverage of debt. This is where you uncover the bizarre hidden layer of their accounting. Their public ledgers, Masterpieces of bookkeeping, tracked loans to Britain, Austria, Prussia, and even France. Italy maintained a second, secret set of books, causal ledger. In these ledgers, the transactions were not recorded in francs, pounds, or guilders. The units of account were far more esoteric. An entry might read, expenditure, funding for Prussian mobilization, 300,000 units. Purpose, increased geopolitical pressure on French eastern flank, generating a plus 0.15 deviation in timeline probability towards Belgian convergence. They were not just balancing accounts, they were quantifying their influence over the flow of history itself. Their payments to agents were not always in cash. A more common method was a subtle manipulation of markets, a coordinated sale of bonds in Amsterdam to create a panic. A rumor spread in the London exchange to depress the value of a stock, allowing an agent to position himself correctly and extract his payment without any direct transfer of funds. It was a system of wealth extraction that left no fingerprints. The psychology of these men is one of supreme detachment. They do not see soldiers but numbers on a page, do not see nations but assets in a portfolio. Their allegiance is to the grand equation, and their work is to ensure the material resources are always available to the cartographers who are solving it. You can picture the head of this syndicate receiving two messages on the same day in June 1815. The first, from his agent on the continent, confirms the temporal incision at Waterloo was a success. The second, from his network of couriers, brings the news of Napoleon's defeat hours before the British government receives it, allowing him to make a legendary history-making fortune on the London Stock Exchange. For him, these two events are one and the same, a successful operation, with the financial windfall being merely a pleasant side effect of a correctly executed maneuver in the greater game. But the real question remained. If this banking syndicate represented the modern financial manifestation of the organization, what ancient recurring symbol found in their private ledgers connected their vast wealth to the primordial source of the cartographer's power? The vast, silent machinery of the banking syndicate has provided the fuel. But your investigation now seeks the engine's original design, its primordial blueprint. You move from the world of finance to the realm of pure symbology, searching for the unifying thread that connects the modern bankers to the ancient mystics, the politicians, and the emperor himself. You are in a private vault, deep beneath the headquarters of a Swiss bank, a place far more secure than any national archive. Here, the causal ledger is stored not as a book, but as a series of engraved metallic plates. And on each one, serving as both watermark and seal of authority, is a symbol you have not seen before, yet one that feels instantly, chillingly familiar. Your verifiable touchstone is a symbol universally recognized, the rod of Asclepius, a serpent entwined around a staff. It is the emblem of medicine and healing, a benign image found on the side of ambulances and in the logos of medical organizations worldwide. It represents knowledge used to restore balance to the human body. But the symbol engraved on these plates is a significant and disturbing variation of this ancient motif. It is the primordial sigil of the cartographers of fates, the master symbol from which all their others, the Ouroboros, the unblinking eye, are derived. This is the serpent and the staff. At first glance, it is similar. Serpent coils around a vertical staff, but the details are profoundly different and deeply bizarre. The staff is not a rough-hewn wooden rod. It is depicted as a perfectly smooth crystalline structure, featureless except for faint regular etchings along its length, like the markings on a measuring rule. It does not feel natural, it feels manufactured, a tool of impossible precision. The serpent, too, is different. It is sleek and powerful, its scales rendered with hypnotic detail. But as its head reaches the top of the staff, you see it is not alone. A second, much smaller serpent emerges from behind the staff, its mouth pressed directly against the larger serpent's ear, as if whispering a secret. This is not a symbol of healing. It is a symbol of instruction, of knowledge being transmitted from a hidden source to a powerful agent. You suddenly understand the full allegory. The crystalline staff is the timeline itself, a structured, measurable, yet fundamentally artificial construct. The large serpent is the agent of the shadow cabinet, the martyr-like Talleyrand, or the field operative, coiled around the timeline, able to perceive its flow and move along it. And the smaller, whispering serpent. That is the voice of the organization's core, the inner circle. The true cartographers, who remained completely unseen, their will communicated only as a whisper to their most trusted operatives. The symbol is a complete organizational chart and a mission statement in one. It represents the power to not just observe the timeline, but to manipulate it based on hidden directives. This master symbol connects everything. The broken Ouroboros from the Louisiana Purchase document is this same serpent, temporarily depicted in a state of self-consumption, representing a cycle or a closed loop in a transaction. The unblinking eye from the empty atlas folio is the eye of this serpent, a symbol of their watchful presence. This symbol, the serpent and the staff, is their full coat of arms, displayed only in their most secret sanctums. You trace its lineage backward, finding echoes of it everywhere, hidden in plain sight. You see it subtly altered in the iconography of the Egyptian god, Thoth, the divine scribe. You find variations of it in fragments from the Library of Alexandria, described as the rule of Hermes. You see it in pre-Roman mystery cults, a symbol of knowledge that grants power over fate. It is the signature of an organization that has operated for millennia, seeing empires like Napoleon's not as epochs, but as fleeting moments, temporary tools for their grander, eternal project. The banking syndicate is merely its current public-facing arm. Their mastery of finance, a modern expression of the same ancient power. They measure the world in debt and credit. Their ancestors measured it in prophecies and dynastic cycles. The methodology changes, but the core principle control, through superior knowledge of the system's rules, remains the same. The symbol is their enduring link to the source of their power, a constant reminder that their wealth is not the end goal, but merely the means to serve the whispering serpent. They are the custodians of history's balance sheet. But the real question remained. If the staff in this ancient symbol represented the very structure of the timeline itself, was the map that Napoleon possessed not merely a chart, but a literal physical fragment of that primordial crystalline staff? The question that lingered in the Swiss vault is no longer a question. It is an axiom. The map that Napoleon possessed, the object for which he traded a continent and sacrificed an empire, was not a representation of the crystalline staff from the master symbol. You understand with chilling certainty that it was a literal, physical fragment of it. A sliver of the universe's source code, a shard chipped from the very axis of the timeline. This is why it could not be copied, why its existence was a singular secret. You cannot duplicate a fundamental constant of reality. This revelation forces a complete reevaluation of the artifact's nature. It is not a tool. It is an organism. You are now looking at the map not as a chart, but as a living specimen under a microscope. Its shimmering lines are not inert ink. They are filaments of a crystalline, information-based life form. It has a metabolism. It has a form of consciousness.
Breathe.
You can see it in the way the faint light from the filaments pulses in a slow, steady rhythm, like a sleeping lung. This is not a static document. It is a dynamic living entity, constantly updating itself. Its web of causal pathways shifting and reconfiguring in real time as millions of decisions are made across the globe. It is a live feed of destiny itself, and Napoleon was plugged directly into it. This explains a verifiable and much mythologized aspect of Napoleon's genius, his almost superhuman capacity for mental work. Historians have marveled at his ability to dictate letters on wildly different subjects to 4 secretaries at once, without losing his train of thought. His knack for working for days with minimal sleep, followed by periods of sudden collapse. This was not merely the product of a brilliant mind. It was a symptom of his symbiosis with the map. When he was connected to it, the artifact augmented his cognitive functions, turning his mind into a parallel processor. He could see all the angles, run all the simulations. It's not because he was a genius, but because his brain had been temporarily overclocked by a non-human intelligence. But this symbiosis came at a terrible price. This is the map's most bizarre and horrifying secret. It has an appetite. It is a cognitive parasite. It feeds on the focused mental energy of its user. The more complex the problem Napoleon used it to solve, the more of his own life force it consumed. When he consulted it to plan the elegant trap at Austerlitz, he would have felt a thrilling surge of insight, followed by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep could fix. You are not just reading the map. It is reading you, metabolizing your concentration, your ambition, your very consciousness into the energy it needs to function. The relationship is a form of symbiotic horror. He gained a God's eye view, and in exchange, it slowly, methodically drank his soul. This reframes his exile on St. Helena completely. The St. Helena project was not just him working on the map, it was the map working on him. The energy harvested at Waterloo was the raw power. Napoleon's mind was the focusing lens. The processor needed to guide that power. As he spent his nights calibrating the temporal edit, the map was draining him, using his unparalleled cognitive abilities as fuel for its own immense task. The healing of the timeline was a hungry process. The map's filaments would pulse more brightly as it rewove the damaged strands of causality. And with each pulse, a little more of Napoleon's vitality would be drawn away. His documented illnesses, his growing lethargy, the rapid decline of his physical health, it wasn't just the damp climate or the prison doctors. It was the crystalline parasite finishing its meal. It was in a relationship with an alien god, a living piece of the universe's architecture. The isolation of his exile was therefore absolute, a cosmic loneliness no one else could possibly comprehend. He was the host, and as his work neared completion, the parasite no longer needed him. His death was the final act of the process. The moment the map had extracted the last quantum of energy it required to seal the edit and stabilize the new timeline. But as you watch the map slowly consume the last of Napoleon's life force to seal the final ripple, a far more terrifying question emerges. This entire multi-decade operation, the sacrifice of armies and an emperor, was an act of healing. But what was the original wound? What primordial catastrophe in the forgotten past was so devastating that it required this monstrous cure? The final moments of Napoleon's life are the first moments of your deepest descent into the mystery. His death was the final payment, the last drop of fuel for the temporal engine. Now, with the mechanism powered and the procedure complete, you can finally trace the edit back to its source. You are no longer observing a man. You are following an echo, a ripple in the pond of time traveling backward from the still moment of Napoleon's death in 1821 past the inferno of Waterloo, past the triumph of Austerlitz, through the centuries, into the darkness of a forgotten age. You are watching the map of causality as a disembodied observer. The energy from Waterloo, focused by Napoleon's dying consciousness, forms a brilliant needle-thin beam of light that lances back through the shimmering web of timelines. It moves with impossible speed, traversing eras in seconds. It passes the Renaissance, the Crusades, the age of Charlemagne, and plunges deep into the period historians have labeled, with a distinct shudder, the Dark Ages. The light doesn't stop. It continues deeper, to a time from which almost no written records survive, an age of myth and shadow. It is here, in the mid-6th century AD, that the beam of light finds its target, and you finally see the wound. The event that the entire Napoleonic saga was designed to reverse was not a lost battle or the death of a king. It was a planetary-scale cataclysm. Your verifiable historical anchor is a phenomenon known as the volcanic winter of 536 AD, Byzantine historian. Procopius wrote of a mystery cloud that dimmed the sun for over a year, causing catastrophic crop failures, famine, plague, and societal collapse across the northern hemisphere. Tree ring data and ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica confirm it, for a period of 18 months. An unknown atmospheric event blocked the sun, triggering the single worst period of climate cooling in the last 2 millennia. It was an extinctional-level event that history has largely forgotten. But what you are seeing on the map of causality is far more terrifying than a simple volcanic eruption. The mystery cloud was not ash. The map shows you a timeline where the Earth, in 536 AD, passed through the debris field of a disintegrating extrasolar object, a comet, or rogue planetoid composed of exotic matter. The dust that filled the atmosphere was not just sun-blocking, it was reality warping. It was a fine particulate that did not obey the normal laws of physics. It was a causal contagion. As this dust settled over the Earth, it began to fray the very fabric of the timeline. Cause and effect began to break down. This is the bizarre, sanity-shattering nature of the original catastrophe. You see glimpses of the world under the influence of this contagion, rivers spontaneously flowing backward, trees aging and decaying in minutes, people forgetting their own names, their pasts becoming fluid and unstable. It was not just a dark age of ignorance and plague. It was an age where reality itself was coming undone, a slow-motion unraveling of the laws of the universe. This was the primordial wound, the great unraveling of 536, left unchecked. It would have led to the complete dissolution of the timeline, a descent into a permanent state of quantum chaos where history, memory, and even linear time ceased to exist. The cartographers of fates, the ancient custodians of the timeline, were able to contain it, to erect a kind of causal quarantine around the 6th century, but they could not heal it. The wound continued to fester, poisoning all subsequent history, creating a fundamental instability that threatened to break containment at any moment. This is why our own recorded history of the Dark Ages is so fragmented, so filled with myth and contradiction. Where? I were as. Where? Where? I will whereas. Will whereas. Will where. We are where I will. Now you understand the terrifying necessity of the Napoleonic operation. It was planetary-scale surgery. The energy of Waterloo, focused by Napoleon's mind, was the only force strong enough and precise enough to lance the wound. The beam of light strikes the timeline of 536 AD and performs its function. It does not erase the event, which is impossible. Instead, it introduces a countervirus, a piece of stabilizing code that neutralizes the exotic matter's reality warping effects. It reasserts the fundamental laws of cause and effect. It sutures the wound. You watch as the frayed, chaotic timelines of the 6th century coalesce, stabilize and heal, the change rippling forward, correcting centuries of instability in an instant. The great unraveling has been reversed, but the real question remained. As the timeline settled into its new, healthier configuration, what was the precise, single point of divergence, the one tiny event that the beam of light altered to achieve this monumental healing? The healing of the timeline is a monumental, yet abstract event. To fully comprehend the procedure, you must zoom in from the macro view of a healed epoch to the microscopic instant of the surgical incision. You are now focused entirely on that single, searing beam of light as it arrives at its destination in the year 536 AD. The energy of Waterloo has crossed centuries to reach this moment, and it will be expended in a single surgical strike of unimaginable precision. You are about to witness the point of divergence, the one infinitesimally small change that saved the world. Your focal point is not a battlefield or a king's court. It is a windswept, rocky outcrop on the coast of what would one day be called Iceland. The sky is a terrifying, sickly brown, choked with the reality-warping dust of the extrasolar object. The sun is a pale, heatless disk. The waves of the North Atlantic crash against the shore with a sluggish, unnatural rhythm. On this desolate cliff stands a single lone figure. He is not a king, a warrior, or a famous philosopher. He is an Irish monk, a hermit, a member of a forgotten ascetic tradition known as the Papar, who sought out the most remote corners of the world to be closer to God. This is your verifiable, though deeply obscure, historical fact. Irish monks were among the first humans to reach Iceland. Centuries before the Norse, they sought solitude in what they called the desert in the ocean. This particular monk, whose name is lost to history, is in a state of profound despair. For months, he has watched the world die. The laws of nature, which he saw as the handwriting of God, have dissolved into chaos. His faith is not just shaken, it is shattered. He has concluded that this is not a divine test, but a fundamental failure of creation. God has either abandoned the world or never existed at all. In his hand, he clutches a small leather-bound book. It is a codex, one of the earliest of its kind, containing not scriptures, but a series of complex astronomical and mathematical calculations, a proto-scientific attempt to understand the mind of God through the order of the cosmos. It is the culmination of a lifetime of work, a proof of divine reason. In this moment of ultimate despair, he raises his arm to hurl the book into the sluggish gray sea. It is a symbolic act of surrendering reason itself to the encroaching chaos. The map of causality shows you that this single act is the point of divergence. If the book is destroyed, the last flicker of rational, systematic thought in a key part of the Western world is extinguished. The nascent flame of scientific inquiry, preserved in these isolated monastic communities, dies out. This, combined with the wider societal collapse, would have ensured that when the causal contagion eventually receded, humanity would lack the intellectual tools to rebuild. The great unraveling would become permanent. This is the target of the Waterloo energy. The beam of light, focused by Napoleon's mind, does not strike the monk. It does not cause a lightning bolt or a clap of thunder. The intervention is far more subtle, more elegant, and infinitely more bizarre. At the precise nanosecond that the monk's arm begins its forward motion, the beam makes its edit. It introduces a single, anomalous sensory input into his brain. For a fleeting instant, he hears a sound that does not exist on the desolate cliff. It is the sound of a small child laughing. It is a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. A sound so fundamentally out of place in this dying world that it short-circuits his despair. The sound is a causal ghost, an auditory hallucination engineered with the energy of a battle fought 1,279 years in the future. The monk freezes, his arms still raised. The sound is gone as quickly as it came, but it has done its work. It has pierced his nihilism with a sliver of inexplicable warmth. It is a phenomenon so outside the logic of his despair that it forces a revaluation. Perhaps the world is not just chaos. Perhaps there is a meaning, a pattern that he cannot yet perceive. He lowers his arm. He clutches the book to his chest. He turns from the sea and walks back to his small stone cell. His shattered faith now complicated by a new and profound mystery. He will not solve the mystery, but he will preserve the book. It will be copied, and its knowledge will pass down through the hidden networks of monastic learning, a tiny, fragile flame of reason kept alive through the darkest of centuries. You have witnessed the fulcrum of history, a single sound, a momentary hesitation, a book not thrown into the sea. This was the edit. The world was saved not by an army, but by a single manufactured burst of laughter. But the real question remained. As you contemplate the mind of Napoleon Bonaparte, the ultimate man of action, being used to execute such a delicate, emotion-based intervention, what must have been the final personal choice he was forced to make in his last moments on St. Helena? The manufactured laughter echoes across 13 centuries, a causal ripple that stabilizes a world on the brink of dissolution. The Irish monk turns from the sea, the book of knowledge safe, and the future is secured. But your focus must now snap back to the origin point of that ripple, the stuffy, humid room at Longwood House on St. Helena. You are witnessing the final moments of Napoleon's consciousness. The agonizing seconds after the temporal edit has been successfully deployed. The great work is done, but the contract is not yet fully discharged. There is one final clause, one last personal payment to be made. You are now inside Napoleon's mind. The physical world has faded. The bickering with Hudson Lowe, the damp chill of the room, the pain in his abdomen, all of it is gone. He is adrift in the silent, shimmering web of the map of causality. He has been its master, its partner, and its victim. He has seen the grand architecture of reality, a perspective granted to no other mortal. He feels the successful anchoring of the new timeline. The click as the edited history of 536 AD locks into place, and the subsequent centuries settle into their new, stable configuration. Profound sense of peace washes over him, the satisfaction of a master craftsman completing his magnum opus. He has fulfilled his contract. He has balanced the books. He has saved the world. But the cartographers of fates are not sentimental. Their system is one of absolute balance, and there remains one final, terrible imbalance to correct. Napoleon's personal timeline, this is the verifiable fact of his life. His rise from an obscure Corsican officer to the master of a continent was a 1 in a billion probability, a statistical miracle. His own history is a major anomaly, a massive deviation from the historical mean. Even with his orchestrated defeats, his personal story arc is a wound in the fabric of the timeline, a source of profound instability. It cannot be allowed to stand as it is. The entity that you have come to know as the Shadow Cabinet, the voice of the whispering serpent, now presents him with a final, non-negotiable choice. This is not a conversation in words, but a direct presentation of two distinct, fully realized futures to his consciousness. It is the ultimate test of his character, the final measure of the man. The first option is the timeline he has just spent 6 years meticulously securing. It is the world as we know it. In this timeline, the cataclysm of 536 AD has been neutralized. Civilization develops along the path we recognize. Science, reason, and order ultimately prevail over chaos. It is a stable, sane world. But in this timeline, his own legacy is one of hubris and failure. He will be remembered as a brilliant but flawed tyrant, a warmonger whose ambition ultimately led to his own pathetic downfall on a remote island. His victories will be taught, but always with the caveat of his ultimate defeat. His empire, the physical manifestation of his life's work, is a footnote, a temporary disruption in the grand sweep of European history. He, Napoleon Bonaparte, is the tragic villain of the story. The second option is a glimpse into the timeline, as it would have been if he refused the final term of the contract. In this vision, his personal legacy is secured. The cartographers offer to repay his service by stabilizing his own timeline. His empire endures. The victory at Waterloo is his. The Bonaparte dynasty rules Europe for centuries. His name is not a byword for hubris, but the very definition of glory, a second Caesar whose reign ushers in a new golden age. He is remembered as the greatest man who ever lived. However, to achieve this, the energy of Waterloo must be redirected from healing the 6th century to cementing his own 19th century power. The wound of 536 AD is left to fester. In this glorious Napoleonic future, the laws of physics are subtly but irrevocably broken. The causal contagion continues its slow, creeping spread. The world is glitteringly imperial on the surface, but it is built on a foundation of creeping madness. Reality is a beautiful, fragile shell over a core of pure chaos. This is his ultimate choice. He must decide between his personal empire and the sanity of the world. He must weigh his own immortal glory against the quiet, uncelebrated salvation of history itself. It is the choice between being a god in a mad world or a forgotten janitor in a sane one. For a man whose entire being was fueled by ambition, glory, and legacy, this is the most exquisite torture imaginable. The choice is presented. The scales are before him. His answer will be his final act, his true last word. But the real question remained, that silent internal moment. Which path did the man who crowned himself emperor choose? He chooses our world. In the final silent moments of his existence, adrift in the cosmic library of the map, Napoleon Bonaparte performs his one truly selfless act. He renounces the timeline where his glory is eternal and accepts the one where he is a footnote, a villain, a failure. He chooses a sane world that will revile him over a mad world that would worship him. The choice is made, and the second option, the glittering imperial timeline, dissolves into nothingness. The contract is fulfilled. His consciousness, its purpose served, and its energy expended, begins to fray. You are now experiencing the direct psychological consequence of this choice and the years of symbiosis with the map. This is the torment of knowledge, the horrifying price of having seen the architecture of reality. As his mind unspools, he is no longer anchored to a single point in time. His consciousness, untethered from his dying body, begins to drift uncontrollably through the web of causality he has spent so long navigating. This is not a gentle fading into the light. It is a violent, chaotic explosion of perception. He is experiencing all of his life's moments at once. He feels the searing cold of the Russian winter on his skin at the same instant he feels the oppressive Egyptian sun. He is simultaneously a young, hopeful cadet at the military academy in Brienne and the bloated, dying prisoner of St. Helena. He hears the roar of the cannons at Austerlitz, the whisper of Josephine in his ear, the jeers of the Parisian mob, and the fabricated laughter of a child 13 centuries away, all in the same eternal moment. His personal timeline, which he just sacrificed, is collapsing in on him. This is the verifiable but misunderstood nature of his deathbed agony. The doctors saw the physical symptoms of stomach cancer and hepatitis. They could not see the man's soul being ripped apart by a storm of temporal paradoxes. But the torment goes deeper. It's not just his own life he is experiencing. What is the ghost of the timeline he rejected? He sees flashes of the world he could have had. He sees his son, Napoleon II, reigning as emperor from a gleaming, technologically advanced Paris. He sees steam-powered airships bearing his end crest, patrolling the skies of a united Europe. He sees monuments to his glory that dwarf the pyramids. These are not memories or dreams. They're the phantom limbs of a history he amputated. The map, in its final moments of connection with his mind, is showing him the full, agonizing extent of his sacrifice. It is one thing to choose duty over glory in theory. It is another to be shown in vivid, agonizing detail, the exact glory you have thrown away. This is the source of the bizarre, contradictory statements he mutters in his final hours. He calls out for Marshal Lannes, a man who died years before at the Battle of Waterloo. He is not hallucinating. He is momentarily existing in a timeline where Lannes survived. He speaks of battle plans for campaigns that never happened. He is seeing the strategic possibilities of the world he gave up. He is a ghost, haunting his own potential histories. The human mind is not built to contain this. It is not designed to perceive multiple, contradictory realities simultaneously. The experience is the definition of insanity. It is the ultimate psychological horror, to be trapped at the nexus of what is, what could have been, and what should never be. As his final energies drain away, consumed by the map to seal the last cracks in our reality, his perception narrows. The storm of timelines recedes, and he is left with one final, clear image. It is the Irish monk on the cliffside in 536 AD, lowering his arm, clutching the precious book to his chest. He sees the tiny, fragile flame of reason preserved. He sees the future he chose, our future unspooling from that single, quiet act of faith. It is a stable, logical, and sane future where he is a monster. In his last moment of lucidity, he understands. The greatest victory of his entire life was not Austerlitz. It was ensuring that he would be remembered as a loser. His consciousness dissolves, the torment is over. Duh. But the real question remained. As our own stable timeline marches forward, are there any lingering echoes, any faint, inexplicable ripples in our modern world that betrayed the monumental edit that was made to save it? Napoleon's consciousness dissolves, the price for our reality paid in full. The timeline is healed, the wound of 536 AD sutured, the causal contagion neutralized. The world you and I inhabit feels solid, logical, and predictable. History marches forward with a comforting sense of inevitability. Science works. Cause precedes effect. The sun rises in the east, but you are now attuned to a different frequency. You have seen the edit, the monumental act of cosmic surgery that secured this stability, and you understand that no surgery is ever perfectly clean. There are always scars. There are always echoes. You are now a detective of the mundane, searching not for grand conspiracies, but for the tiny, inexplicable glitches in the matrix of our modern world. These are the subtle ripples, the faint reverberations of the massive temporal shift that anchored our reality. They are not dramatic paradoxes. They're small, persistent oddities that science struggles to explain, that logic cannot fully contain. These are the echoes of Napoleon's secret deal. Your first piece of evidence is a verifiable phenomenon that sits at the edge of psychology and quantum physics. The Global Consciousness Project. Run for decades out of Princeton University, this experiment uses a global network of random number generators. Under normal conditions, these devices produce pure mathematical noise. However, The project has documented that during moments of immense shared global focus events, like 9/11s, major natural disasters, or even worldwide celebrations, the output of these machines deviates from randomness. It becomes slightly, but measurably, ordered. Scientists have no accepted explanation for this. It seems to suggest that collective human consciousness can exert a physical influence on the quantum world. You see it for what it is: a faint echo of the energy harvesting ritual at Waterloo. The principle of the cartographers that concentrated human emotion can affect physical realities still active. A lingering after effect embedded in the new timeline, now detectable by our most sensitive instruments. Next, you examine the bizarre and persistent phenomenon of glitch reports and Mandela effects, where large groups of people share clear, detailed memories of events or details that have never existed. People remember a movie with a different ending, a brand logo spelled a different way, a historical event happening on a different date. These are typically dismissed as the fallibility of human memory, but you see something deeper. These are not false memories. They are memory fragments from the alternate timelines that were pruned and discarded during the Great Edit. When Napoleon made his final choice, countless potential histories were collapsed and overwritten. But information, like energy, cannot be truly destroyed. It leaves behind faint traces, memory fossils that can occasionally surface in the collective unconscious, creating these shared, inexplicable recollections of a world that almost was. Finally, your investigation leads you to the most personal and unnerving echo: the unshakable feeling of being watched that people sometimes experience in places of great historical weight. You are standing in a place like the battlefield of Waterloo, the ruins of the Roman Forum, or the Tower of London. There is no one there, but you feel a palpable presence, a sense of deep, ancient observation. This is not a ghost in the traditional sense. It is a resonance from the shadow cabinets network. The unblinking eye you saw in the empty atlas folio is not just a symbol. It is a description of their function. They are the eternal watchers, the custodians. The observatories like the one in the Alps are not all physical. Some are psychic, nodes of observation anchored to places of historical significance. The feeling of being watched is the faint subconscious detection of their timeless, silent vigil. These are the scars on our reality. Inexplicable statistical anomalies, the shared false memories, the sense of ancient observation, they are the faint, persistent whispers of the war that was fought for the soul of our timeline. Our world is stable, but it is a stability that was bought at a terrible price. And the receipt for that transaction is woven into the very fabric of our daily lives, hidden in plain sight. They are reminders that the history we read in books is a polished, simplified version of a far stranger and more fragile truth. But the real question remained: if these are the echoes of the past, what of the watchers themselves? Does the organization that orchestrated this monumental act still exist today? And if so, what is their purpose now? The echoes of the Great Edit are faint but persistent, scars on the skin of our reality. They are the artifacts of a completed project. But the organization that executed this project, the cartographers of fates, did not simply vanish once the timeline was secured. An entity that measures its existence in millennia does not disband after a single successful operation, no matter how monumental. Your investigation now moves from the past to the unsettling present, searching for the modern incarnation of the shadow cabinet. You are no longer in an archive or a battlefield. You are in the hyper-connected, data-saturated world of the 21st century. The tools of the cartographers have evolved. You no longer rely on spies in royal courts or ciphers on velvet mantles. Their modern observatory is the global network itself. They are the masters of big data, the silent listeners in the endless river of digital communication. They are not a government agency like the NSA, nor are they a corporation like Google. They are something older, quieter, and with a far grander mandate. They are the custodians. Their purpose has shifted. For centuries, their primary mission was the containment and eventual healing of the 536 AD wound. With that task complete, their role has transitioned from active intervention to passive guardianship. They are now the enduring watch, the silent sentinels of the timeline they worked so hard to save. Their prime directive is to prevent the emergence of another catastrophic, reality-warping threat. They are the universe's immune system, constantly scanning for new causal contagions. You can see their influence in the strange, synchronous way that certain technologies emerge. The verifiable fact is that major scientific breakthroughs often occur simultaneously and independently in different parts of the world. This is usually attributed to the free flow of information, but you see the subtle guidance of a hidden hand. The cartographers gently nudge scientific development along paths that promote stability. They might subtly leak an anonymous paper onto a university server that pushes fusion research in a safer direction. Or they might quietly fund a small, obscure biotech firm whose work on genetic sequencing helps to build a firewall against a potential future pandemic. Their interventions are small, precise, and always deniable, designed to steer the ship of progress away from the icebergs they can see on the horizon. Their recruitment methods have also modernized. The test is no longer an unsolvable paper paradox. Today, a potential candidate might be a brilliant young coder who stumbles upon a section of the deep web that seems to defy all protocols. A ghost server that responds to queries not with data, but with eerily prescient questions. Or it might be a hedge fund analyst who designs an algorithm that starts predicting market crashes with impossible accuracy, only to realize the algorithm is not just analyzing financial data, but seems to be tapping into the collective emotional state of the entire planet. As before, most will dismiss these anomalies. But the few who become obsessed, who cannot let the paradox go, will find themselves guided down a new career path, their talents quietly repurposed for a grander mission. The bizarre nature of their current operations is their focus on narrative. They have learned from the Napoleonic project that the most powerful force in human history is not an army or a technology, but a story. Their primary work now is to act as the gardeners of the global narrative. They understand that a dangerous idea, a story virus, can be as destructive as a causal contagion. They work from the shadows to subtly discredit destabilizing ideologies, to bolster narratives that promote long-term thinking and cooperation, and to ensure that humanity's story continues to bend, however slowly, towards sanity and survival. They are not censoring information. They are curating consensus reality, maintaining the very story of the world. They are the ultimate quiet professionals. They seek no credit. They desire no power in the conventional sense. They are the anonymous reviewers of history. It's the editors who ensure the book of humanity does not end in a chapter of self-inflicted nonsense. Their headquarters is nowhere and everywhere. They are a distributed network of minds, their communications hidden in the background noise of global data traffic, their meetings held in the encrypted spaces between the ones and zeros. They are watching, always watching, for the next Napoleon, the next 536 AD, the next threat to the fragile reality they paid for with the soul of an emperor. But the real question remained. What of the map itself, the living artifact that was both the tool and the prize? Where is it now, and what is its purpose in a healed world? The custodians of today do not command armies. They command server farms and hedge funds. Their influence is silent and pervasive as the background radiation of the cosmos. But what of the instrument at the heart of it all? The living shard of reality that was traded for a continent and fueled by the soul of an emperor. Your final journey takes you to the end of the earth, to a place of permanent cold and profound silence, where the map now rests. You are in a vault, carved deep into the permafrost of the high Arctic. Its existence one of the most closely guarded secrets on the planet. The location is a modern parallel to the ancient Alpine Observatory, but its purpose is inverted. This is not a place of action, but of eternal vigilance. Here you find your final verifiable fact. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault. A real-world sanctuary designed to protect the future of humanity's food supply from a global catastrophe. The cartographers have created something similar, but infinitely more profound. The Seed Vault protects our biological code. This vault protects our causal code. It is a sanctuary for the timeline itself. You enter a circular chamber, the air frigid and utterly still. There are no computer monitors, no blinking lights. There is only the map. It is not lying on a table. It is suspended in the exact center of the room, floating in a perfect vacuum, held in place by a barely visible field of magnetic force. Its internal light is now a dim, soft, rhythmic pulse, like the slow, deep breathing of a hibernating leviathan. It is dormant. Active. Parasitic relationship with the human host is over. It is no longer a tool to be wielded. It is a seismograph for reality, and its purpose now is simply to be. This is its final, bizarre legacy. The map sleeps, and in its sleep it dreams. The custodians who guard this vault are not technicians. They are interpreters of these dreams. Most of the time, the map's shimmering surface is calm. But sometimes, a flicker of chaotic light will race across a pathway of brief. It's a terrifying vision of a potential future crisis, a new causal contagion, a nascent paradox. These are the map's nightmares. The custodians record these events, analyzing them, using them to guide their subtle, preventative interventions in the world above. They watch the sleeping god for any sign of it stirring, praying that it never fully awakens. For if the map's light ever blazes with the intensity it had for Napoleon, it will mean a threat of 536-level magnitude has returned. The map's legacy is a whisper, a permanent, low-grade warning that the stability we take for granted is a fragile, constructed thing. Napoleon's sacrifice bought us this world, a reality rescued from the brink of dissolution. The shadow cabinet, the cartographers, the custodians, they are the anonymous gardeners who tend to it. They are the price of order. The story of Napoleon's secret deal is the story of how our sane, logical world was born from an act of cosmic madness, a history forged in a transaction of impossible scale. But the real question remained. Now that you know the price of a stable reality, can you ever again look at a simple coincidence, as a moment of luck, or a shared strange memory, as just a random occurrence? The story, for now, is complete. The map continues its slow, deep breathing in the frozen silence of its Arctic vault. The custodians maintain their endless, unseen watch, their faces illuminated by the soft, rhythmic pulse of the sleeping artifact. The great grinding gears of the timeline, sutured and secured, continue to turn, and the world you know remains solid beneath your feet. You can pull back from the abyss now. The journey into the secret architecture of history is over. Let the image of the whispering map fade, receding into the quiet darkness from which it came. The tension can finally release its grip, leaving only the faint, lingering echo of the questions it raised. The world outside your window continues its steady, unfolding story, unaware of the colossal sacrifices that made its simple, linear progression possible. The vast and intricate web of causality settles back into its quiet hum. Its secrets once again submerged beneath the surface of the mundane. The whispers of pruned timelines and forgotten catastrophes fade into the background noise of everyday life, becoming just another part of the world's deep and silent mystery. In that quiet, you can finally rest,